Daddy. I'm hugging God. Maybe if I hug him real hard, he'll save us from...
Hi everyone, I'm Luke Hector and this is The Broken Meeple, a show where I devote my time to raving and ranting about board games, but usually more the latter part if we're honest. Well, this is going to be a slightly emotional video for me because this is Limit by Ludonaught, one that I was very interested to get played when I heard its premise, but more so because this is effectively Ludonaugh's swan song. Because after Limit and Arigato, which I've already done a review for, they announced that they were basically going to stop making games at that point. So, a shame, because Ludonaught have some nice people working there. They've always been quite, vocal on, BGG. They've been very helpful, and I think in a different room, yes, not here, I believe it's definitely somewhere, but, I have Living Forest on my shelf, which is still an excellent game, so they've done some really nice stuff in the past, and it will be sad to see them go. Well, I was hopeful that this one was going to be like, yes, this will be the brilliant game that I can shout from the mountaintops. This is inspired by a model based on the Meadows report, the limits to grow. It was done in the 70s, and the idea is that in kind of layman's terms, it's about saying that if you have, you cannot have constant growth in a finite world because, we're growing, population is growing, industry is growing, technology is growing, that kind of thing. But when you've only got finite resources, eventually it's going to cause problems. You're going to have crises and all sorts. Well, this is kind of a game that simulates that. So the idea is that players will take control of a nation and they will have production tracks and resources to micromanage and stuff and population tracks. And essentially they will decide with cards what they're going to do in terms of, shall I increase this production? Shall I go get these resources? Shall I go, stage a war with someone else? And based on those actions, your board is going to update through a bunch of simultaneous steps. And it's a case of, well, can you keep your nation in check without it spiraling out of control? It can be played from 1 to 6 players. That did have me slightly worried because anything with that wide a scope for player count is usually doomed to failure at certain player counts. But the premise sounded cool. I like these games, and these sort of games that touch on these environmental and sort of global style themes. I mean, Daybreak that came out, I wasn't a big fan of that game. I got a lot of pushback for saying that one was only a 5 out of 10. I still stand by it, but hopefully this can be a better example of that type of game. But it's also probably the heaviest looking game that Ludonaught have ever done. They don't tend to do very heavy games, and this one, where it claims 40 minutes a player, certainly is potentially putting this on the heaviest side of anything that they've ever done. So it's like, okay, this is very different for Ludonaught. So even if this game isn't, something that I can shout to from the mountaintops about, it's still going to be something to give respect, to say, hey, you tried something different. In a world where we have got just the same old stuff being released all the time, this is something a little bit different. So, let's get stuck into Ludonaught games for what may be the last time.
I hate endings.
So Limit is played over 7 rounds, 7 generations as it's called, and players have their own player board, of which you can pick the one with more art or the one with none. It's still the same thing at the end of the day. But there's also a central world board with effectively a stock market for the prices of resources, buy, sell, supply, demand, we know how that works, as well as, a world bank, which is essentially money that the world has, and this is where the money comes to and from, so that can cause its own share of problems. But what you'll have on your board is you'll have a collection of pieces in your little tuck box here. You get given a tuck box for yourself, and for the most part it's telling you several things. It's telling you what your population is in terms of millions. It's telling you what your unrest level is for your nation. So do the people like what you're doing, or are they going to start rising up in arms and saying, oi, we want this overthrown? You've got your different housing classes. So you've got like the upper class, middle class, lower class, and depending on what levels they are, have different effects on your nation. And then you've also got 3 production tracks, which are represented by little factory tokens here. One gives you food to feed everybody, one gives you consumer goods to kind of supply everybody and keep them happy, and one is military in order to keep everybody in check or start doing military actions against other players, and a little stock level so you can tell what's what. So what happens is that you have 3 decks of cards, and you play this game in 7 generations, as I mentioned, through essentially 3 main phases: a politics phase, a social phase, and an international phase. Now, 2 of those phases are effectively simultaneous running down the checklist and making sure you do stuff. Most of what the player is doing is in the politics phase. So what you get to do is you follow this very good reference aid, which looks more complicated than it actually is. But essentially it's got in each phase which social class affects it. So in the politics phase, your upper A class is going to affect which column you look at, and you've got a little tracker here of which you basically just go down and follow the basic steps. But in the politics phase, what you eventually get to do is that you will have started with 4 cards that are starting cards at the beginning of the game. And depending on what level you're at, you will get a couple of maybe new cards that were set aside at the start. But mainly you'll get to look at so many from a specific deck. One is better for industry, one's better for economy, one's better for military, that kind of thing. And you get to look at these bunch of cards and decide, you know what, I'll take this one and put it at the bottom. These cards effectively have a cost in money and, maybe housing or maybe giving you unrest to use, but these have various effects on your nation board. They may affect other players. There are some military ones that have an effect like waging terrorism or a military war on somebody, but it can also have an impact on your own. But primarily these cards are going to affect your social classes. So you can upgrade your housing, you can upgrade these production tracks, generate more resources, muck around with the global unrest, buy and sell from the stock market. So if you buy, the price goes up. If you sell, the price goes down, that kind of thing. And they essentially muck around with your nation. And at that time, you probably won't know exactly what effect this is going to have until you get to the social phase. Now, this is when you get to run through simultaneously. The first part is in turn order, but in this part, you run simultaneously down this massive checklist worth of stuff, which, like I say, looks more complicated than it actually is. But as you go through, it will say, right, you've got to feed your people, 1 for every population. Okay, cool. Right, now I've got to consume goods. Well, depending on what level class the middle class effectively is, I've got to pay a certain amount of consumer goods. Okay, fine. What's my population growth? Do I get more population? Is there a birth rate? That kind of thing. Economic growth, which one of these automatically level, whether you like it or not. And you might think, well, that's good, isn't it? Again, this game's called Limit for a reason. There are problems with that. Tax, how much money do you get from the population? Production, how much resources do you produce? And, what public order? What level is your, public order at? Is there an uprising or is there an economic boom? Again, that has effects. And you basically just wander through the entire list and generate the stuff and pay the stuff as per what is on the reference aid. So that is essentially a simulator part. The international phase is essentially where you resolve crises or alliances with other players. Alliances are where you can make little alliances with players in a 4+ player game. You can't use it in a 2 or 3, unfortunately. And these alliances kind of are like, right, well, if I need to pay for something and I don't quite have enough military, can you give me a hand with that? And there's repercussions if you go against your word. But the crises depend on certain aspects. So there will be, there will be cards at the bottom of this board with environmental tokens on them, so pollution basically. There'll be another one with disruption or unrest tokens, so you can imagine that doing stuff like terrorism and that is going to have an effect. And if these cards deplete, or if the money in the World Bank depletes, there's financial, military, and environmental crises. And as these resolve, players are going to suffer negative effects based on what they've done. Like if they're the ones that contributed a lot to the pollution, they're going to suffer worse than everybody else, but everybody's going to take a hit in some regard. If you get to the end of 7 generations, the game ends, but if 4 crises have happened, the game will automatically end there as well. So there are 2 ways the game can sort of end there. And if you have a shortage in paying anything from food or consumer goods or military or fossil fuels, for example, then that's going to have a negative effect on you. It's going to make people unrest. It's going to reduce your social housing. There's a lot of different things that all of these parts of the game will impact on with your nation board. By the time you get to the end of 4 crises or 7 generations, you score based on what crises have happened and what you've got on your board in terms of victory points, like your military level, how good your class level is, what your population level is, that kind of thing. And then, of course, the one with the most. Of course! So you'll notice a bunch of tuck boxes and sort of boards with cutout bits. Believe me, this took me a long time to unbox. You've got tuck boxes to put together. You have got a ton of stuff to punch out. And bear in mind, all of these are little holes for the trackers. Punch, 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 little bits that don't always come off cleanly. It's like, oh, this was a bit of a chore to get unboxed. But once you're done, it's kind of ironic that all the stuff that you've punched out is effectively, wasted cardboard. So you better have your recycling bin handy for that. But, You know, otherwise there is a lot of bits. You know, your tuck box has a contents list at the bottom to tell you exactly what is meant to go in there for each player, which is cool. You put your cards in there and all the things are counted out. So you have so many of the birth rate tokens, you have so many of these territory tokens, so many of these resource counters, so much money in these denominations. And it's cool that it goes through and easily has that labeled. The problem is the tuck boxes are not very well designed. I mean, they are too loose at the bottom. There's too much of a gap. So when you have all these little tokens in here, the second you tilt it even slightly, things get stuck, they fall out, and unfortunately, you know, take a leaf out of Weird City Games with their tuck boxes. They do really good ones. These, unfortunately, aren't quite up to par. The solution is that you basically do what I did. You put the cards in the box, you put all the components in a single bag, put it in a box. It at least keeps it neat in the box because, they say, once you've got all these tuck boxes, you effectively just have 9 tuck boxes and the boards on top. So it's a very clean system and doesn't take too long to set up as a result because all your tokens are basically there for a player. But it does require you to analyze them in advance, and you are going to need to do the bag. You know, at your own risk, don't use a baggie with these tuck boxes because, trust me, it's going to frustrate you like crazy. I have to say, even though it's built to a slight budget with its component quality, they clearly spent the extra 50p to make sure it was relatively easy to play. You know, there's certainly a lot going on and stuff to keep track of, but, man, this reference aid and the rulebook, they're great. They're stellar, in fact. You know, this rulebook has got, you know, FAQ bits for all the cards in the game. And I thought, okay, there's a fair few pages here to get through the rules. I thought this is going to take me a while to do. It really isn't. The setup is nice and clear, you know, as to where everything goes. I didn't have any problems with that. You know, the nation board and how your levels work, it explains the relevance of certain aspects of your board during the setup. So you get an idea while you're setting up what things are for. You know, the how to play bit, it basically goes through every step of the reference aid because that is effectively the game phase, and it shows how it works, the different options, pictorial example for every single step. And you basically just go through the individual steps and it explains really clearly how they work with a little bit of flavor text to understand the concept behind it. And this is definitely a fairly thematic game, it being based on this model. And so when you bear that theme in mind, a lot of this stuff kind of makes sense. There's one or two minor, you know, inconsistencies, maybe the odd error here and there, like minor iconography errors and that, but they're very minor and very few. I didn't come across very many at all, and most of it is pretty self-explanatory as to what it was meant to be. But man, it was a super clear rulebook to get through. And this reference aid, brilliant. The iconography in this game is very intuitive as to what things mean. You know, like -1 military for each population at a level of your population -2. You might think that sounds complicated to represent in icons. It really isn't. It's pretty easy to tell. And it's got a little symbol to refer to shortages so you know what to look for in there. And even then, -1 population, +3 unrest, -1 production. It's easy to tell what they are when you've played it a bit. But you're all given this little tracker. So if you've got it here, you essentially go, right, social class for A is 3. Right, so I start at that bit. That gets me this new card. Then it lets me look at 5 cards from a deck and take 2. Then it lets me discard down to 7 hand size. Then we start the playing of the cards. And the whole playing of the cards, which I didn't mention too much in the overview, is that you essentially take it in turns to play 2 cards for the costs, 1 card and then pass, or just pass. If somebody targets you, you get brought back into the fray, but otherwise it's play cards until you pass, basically. But the instant card effects come back to your hand, the passive ones stay out in play, so it's a little bit different from other games. But then once you get to the simultaneous bit, of which everybody can do this at the same time, so even with 5 or 6 players, doesn't add too much extra time length, although lowest common denominator, I've always said this, you go, right, my medium class C is at level 2. So, okay, right, supply, 1 food per population. Go discard down to 10 food. Consumer goods, 1 consumer good per population at a lower level. Increase population by 1. Okay, fine. Lower birth rate doesn't apply. Economic growth, I have to boost this up by 1 and this up by 1. Fine. Taxation plus free money per population. And, you know, you go through these steps, but they're very easy to follow. Once you've done 1 round of this game, it's very easy to rinse repeat for subsequent rounds. And it's just You know, even on the back, it gives you card summary for like, what the icons mean and like what the different cards do. You've got a little brief bit as to how the alliances work. You've got the scoring at the end of the game, and you've got what happens with the free crises. This is one of the best reference aids I have seen for any game, and honestly, if this didn't have a good reference aid, I think it would be damn near unplayable because of the amount of steps you have to go through, for the amount of bits and tokens that you've got around and how one thing impacts another. So they done a stellar job with that. Okay, so from that standpoint, wow. In terms of how much you are as a player kind of doing anything in this game, that's a little bit limited because you mainly are going through this chart, step by step, going through and updating things on your board. That stuff just happens. Yes, you're doing it, so you are involved, but it's still a simulation at the end of the day. You're just following a process. The main point where you yourself get to make decisions about what you do is primarily the politics phase, where you get to draw some cards, decide which ones you want to keep, and then when you've got your cluster of cards in your hand, how am I going to play them this turn? That is the meat of the game from a player perspective. The rest of it is all entirely pretty much a simulation, and that kind of puts me in two minds, because on the one hand, the simulator is good. It's a good simulator, and it does cause some, you know, the book goes, you know, and certainly when you read the design notes and stuff, it does lean heavily into the whole, we've discussed, you know, like how this happens, and when you play this game, it's gonna lead to some thoughts and some deep thoughts and discussions about how this happened or what happened there, and it's like, if you're using this as an educational tool, I can see that. If you're playing this as a board game, that's not really happening. What does happen though when you play it with other players is you do get a bit of a laugh when you watch everything spiral out of control, because the first few generations you think, this is pretty easy, not doing that much. I played a couple of cards, my social housing went up by 1, pop went up by 1, I got a little bit of extra food production. Okay, great. Oh, I'll do some intensive farming. That's fine, I get more food. Yeah, it might cost me a little bit of fossil fuels and that, but not that big a deal. First 3 generations you have that for. 4th one plus, you start seeing the real impact of what it is you did early. And it does lead to a lot of chuckles when you look around the players and watch as people just go nuts because their whole board just implodes on themselves. Oh! It's hilarious actually watching what happens to people, particularly when they've only played the game for the first time, maybe second time, and they don't realise just how impactful their stuff is. So it's almost just funny enough to watch the after effects of what happens. But that being said, it's more a chuckle and a fun simulator, but it's still hard to tell if it's really a game. You know, yes, you are making decisions with the cards, but that's the only decisions you make. There's like a minor decision with economic growth later on where you can decide between 2 industries whether to up it or down it. That's it. Other than that, everything else is set in stone. You're just following a process. A smooth process, fair play, but everything else, resolving the crises, you know, doing all the stuff on your board, it's entirely procedural. So this is the real meat of the game. Is that enough to justify having to teach the game to people and having to spend 40 minutes a player here? Because this game does take a while. When you're going through 7 generations with that many people and following the processes, yes, a lot of it is simultaneous, but you're still playing this for a good couple of hours at least, if not more, you know, with more players to get this finished. And it's like, is that enough activity for you to warrant the game length? You know, as a game? As an educational tool, great, but, you know, as a game, is that enough? I'm not entirely sure it is. And the solo mode in here is not particularly great either. The solo mode is literally, the cards are in one of the boxes, you just get 9 event cards, and there's no AI as such. It just basically has fixed values in each round for population and military and stuff like that. And you flip over an event card at the end of the round and it does something that's usually quite painful to you. That's it. It just throws a spanner in the works. You don't beat the AI score or anything, you're just trying to get a certain amount of points yourself. Good luck with that. I mean, you can end up with minus 1 million points in this game because you did badly pretty easily. And it wants you to score 100 in the solo mode. Good luck with that. I mean, you've got to play this game in a very specific way in order to score anything like that high. But solo mode doesn't really work because, you know, the alliance rules only appear in a 4, 5, 6 player game. They don't appear in a 2 and 3 player game. A 2 and 3 player game would take much less time, but you don't get the cool alliance thing. And it's not like a massive, amazing thing, but it adds that little bit of interaction with other players, because otherwise you don't really interact with other players that much. So taking out the alliance rule makes 2 and 3 player games a little bit worse, and obviously it makes solo even worse in that regard. But the other problem is that some of the cards in solo mode just outright don't work. You know, some of these military cards require you to spend a certain amount of military, and the opponent can resist if they spend as much military as you spent, right? The AI has way higher military than most people will, and even then they will always resist you. They never choose not to. So a lot of your cards just don't work well against the AI. You don't even gain that much if you do succeed against them. So it's very costly to use those cards, and you don't get much reward for it. Whereas against a human player, if they're weak on military, it's very cheap and you could get something cool and it messes them over and stuff. Yeah, there is a bit of direct interaction in this game with some of the cards. You could get messed over. You are going to have to deal with that. That is a potential problem. But yeah, in solo mode, there are just some cards that I will never use, ever. And some cards that I might even use every single time, no matter what. And it just causes a bit of a weird balance shift. I'm just not a fan of this in solo play, and I don't recommend it if that's your intention. But then 2 or 3 misses out the alliance rule, so really you're playing this with 4, 5, and 6, and if you're doing that, you are playing a long game for something that you're just basically doing card play for, and the rest is a simulation. So it's a little bit tough to review this one, because on the one hand, I give it respect for its theme. I like seeing what happens to your nation as you do it. It's kind of like an experiment. You know, one game I'm going to decide, you know what happens if I made food really productive at the expense of other stuff? Well, I succeed in this, and that's all good. But now I'm short on this, poof! You know, it explodes. Okay, the next game I go, well, let's just balance out food a little bit. Let's go high on military. This should be all right. Cool. You know, the unrest is fine. I can keep that in check. Don't have enough consumer goods. I got a shortage. It's fun to go through that simulation, but it does take a fair bit of time. I think Yes, I think it will be on Board Game Arena. So I could see this actually being more fun to play on Board Game Arena, because it will go through all that simulation stuff very quickly, because it will all be automated, and you just get to have fun with the card play. So this game actually will probably be better in a digital version than it will be in this like normal version, especially when you've got all these little bits with tiny little tokens to manipulate. It can get a little fiddly, but it has its fun moments. But is it enough gameplay? It's an odd one. I don't know if I like it or not. It's really hard. I get what this is trying to do, and maybe I'm not the right audience, I don't know, but you know, theme-wise I like it. But if most of it is just a simulation and all I'm really doing decision-wise is the card play, I don't know if I want to sit here for 2 to 2.5 hours with a bunch of other people just to see what the experiment is like. You know, the digital version will at least make that a lot quicker. And sadly, the solo mode is just not fun enough for me, so I can't bring this out by myself. It's weird. I really don't know what to rate this like. You know, it's done well. There's a lot of good aspects to this. I think it's just going to depend on what kind of game you're after. I don't know. I think in the physical version, I've got to sort of give it a little bit of tough love. I think I'm going to give this one a 6 out of 10 from a personal gameplay perspective. All right, that's still above average. That's still a game I enjoy playing and would like. You know, I just don't think that there's enough gameplay with the card element to justify everything else that you got to do in this to like give it a massive recommendation. But I still think it's good-ish. You know, it's still a fine game. I think on Board Game Arena that rating could jump up slightly because it takes out a lot of the automation and makes the game shorter. I think as an educational tool, I think this definitely would deserve a Sealer recommendation, like 7, 8 out of 10. I think if you're going to use this as a teaching guide for this kind of report, I think it's a good discussion point and a fun way to get this message across. I've learned a little bit about this report I never knew existed before as a result of playing this game. So it has, you know, conjured up the brain cells and, you know, given me some food for thought, which is cool that a board game can do that. So is it more of a simulator than it is a game? Probably true. Is it better as an educational tool than a game? Again, probably true, which is why I can only really go as high as a 6 out of 10 from a personal standpoint. But I could see myself playing this on BGA in the future. I could see myself playing this, you know, if people wanted to play it, you know, and had it available, subject to player count and that. But I gotta give props that they've made it relatively cost effective. They've, you know, minus the tuck boxes, you know, you can sort that out with baggies. It does keep storage nice and good. The setup doesn't take very long. The reference aid is stellar, like really well done. The rules are really well done. So there's good stuff here. I just don't know if there's enough gameplay here. So I'd be interested to know your thoughts. This review's gone on too long for a speed review anyway. You know, I need to wrap this one up, so 6 out of 10, but let me know your thoughts down in the comments. What do you think of this game? Do you think there's enough gameplay? Do you think there isn't? Do you like to use it for education? Do you not? I really would be interested to know what the thoughts from people who have played this is. I think this is going to raise a few interesting discussion points about how much of a game this is and, you know, whether it is one that's definitely worth grabbing for a few people. So yeah, I think it's still solid. I would have loved to have been raving about this from the mountaintops to say it's a 10 out of 10 as it's the last game from Ludonaut that I will likely review. But I gotta give it props for what it does well. But I also gotta give a little tough love for stuff that I'm not sure is, you know, up to speed. But as I say, I'd be interested to know everybody's thoughts on it. And with that said, I need to wrap this up. So that's it for me on this episode of The Broken Meeple. If you like what you see, then please thumb it up on YouTube and thumb it up on Board Game Geek when it goes live on the page. Check out the rest of my channel. There is plenty of reviews to come with a lot of great games and a lot of interesting games and a lot of not so interesting games to review. So yeah, there's definitely plenty of content coming. So take care, and remember, regardless if you enjoy watching your nation just implode on itself on a regular basis, it's still only a game. So bye for now.